Hello, everybody. Welcome to our very special Zazenkai and talk with Taigen Dan Leighton. Taigen, it is an honor to have you here. Everyone offers gasho. Um, Taigen needs very little introduction in the Soto world. His latest book is on our founding ancestor, Dongshan. Just This Is It. But Taigen has written for years on uh, Dogen. He's the translator of Eihei Shingi and Eihei Koroku with Shohaku Okamura. He has written on the great Hongzhi, who was our ancestor in China. Am I correct? Is Hongzhi was in our direct line or no, actually?
Actually, like an uncle. He was his Dharma brother is a few generations or so before Dogen, but yeah, he's part of our lineage.
Yeah, I thought so. Well, I'm going to back out now and just let Taigen briefly say hello to everyone, and then we will sit for about 30 minutes of Zazen. And at this point, I would like to invite people on the waiting list. There are some open spaces. If you want to jump in, now is the time. Taigen, would you say hello?
Hey everyone, it's great to be here. Wherever here is, it seems like here is many places all over the world. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking with you and hearing your comments and questions. So take it away, Jendo.
Well, very good. I'll ring the bell, and we'll be sitting for 30 minutes. You can just sit where you are, wherever you're comfortable, and we'll begin now. Thank you all. We welcome Walter from Argentina. Good to see you, Walter. If you're on the waiting list, now is a good time to jump in if there's a spot. And for the remainder, I'm going to turn it over to Taigen. Taigen, thank you again. Everyone give me a thumbs up when Taigen is talking, just to make sure you can all hear.
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm glad to be here. Today I'm going to talk about the practice of suchness from our ancestor Dongshan, who lived 807-869. And Dundo mentioned some of my other books. Really, since I started doing everyday Zazen 40 plus years ago, I've been studying Dogen and trying to understand Dogen and where he came from. So actually all of my writings are about that, about Dogen and his context. My first book, Cultivating the Empty Field, about Hongzhi, who Junda mentioned, was a century before Dogen in China, very important figure in our tradition. And I've kind of gone full circle back to China after doing many translations of Dogen and books about Dogen. My last book, Zen Questions, has several sections of commentary on Dogen, one just on Dogen's extensive record, Eikoroku, and then I did a book on Dogen and the Lotus Sutra, and another on the basic bodhisattva underpinnings of Soto Zen, Faces of Compassion, about the different bodhisattva archetypal figures. So all of that is kind of background for the context of this tradition, which we're bringing from Japan to the modern world, to the West and beyond. And Dongshan is very, very important. So the book on Dongshan and what I'm going to talk about today, and we'll have some discussion, which I'm looking forward to, is basically about stories or koans from Dongshan. These are, well, his recorded sayings is published a while ago, a translation of that from William Powell, and those recorded sayings, texts of Chinese masters, are like every line is a koan, every line is a teaching story. But more and more I see myself, and I see Dogen as a koan teacher, and koan not in the sense of some problem or nonsense riddle to solve, because that's not what they are, but as teaching stories that help us see our own practice. So I'm not interested in Dongshan as some historical artifact, but his stories, his teachings, I see a straight line from Dongshan to Dogen to my teacher's teacher, Suzuki Roshi, and to modern Soto Zen. A lot of what Dongshan talks about is very relevant for us, but it needs a little unpacking, so a different kind of translation, which is what I've tried to do in this book. Dongshan is best known probably for the Hokya Sama Mer Samadhi long teaching poem. Is that, do you use that in your Sangha, Junda?
Yes, we do. Yes.
And also, excuse me?
Yes, we do.
Oh, great. And also, the 5 degrees, or sometimes from the Rinzai side, they're called the 5 ranks. So in this book, I have chapters on the Jewel Mer Samadhi, the 5 degrees, at the end of the book, but mostly I'm focusing on these teaching stories. And I've selected, a number of them, mostly ones that were used in the Book of Serenity collection of teaching stories. So what I want to do is, well, I'll say a little bit about some of the themes from those, from these stories, and then I'm going to talk about, maybe there'll be time to talk about a couple of them, and then we'll have some discussion. Well, the one that I'm going to start with is about Dongshan when he left his teacher Yunyan, or I don't know if you're familiar with the Japanese names more. Tozan is Dongshan and Yunyan is Ungan Donjo in our Japanese lineage pronunciation. But these stories have to do, in the first one especially, with suchness and the practice of suchness and the relationship of our awareness of suchness is one way of talking about ultimate reality, the universal, the sense of wholeness, the ultimate, kind of the other side of talking about it in terms of emptiness. And really, I think that positive perspective of suchness rather than emptiness is more important in our Soto or Chinese Zaodong tradition. But the question is, how do we, each as particular individual human-type people, engage with suchness, deepen our experience of suchness, but then also express it in our everyday activity and in our responses to the world? And so all of that is one of the major themes of these stories from Dongshan. The relationship of this self or non-self to wholeness, to the ultimate, to the universal. And then part of what comes up in the stories is how this is conveyed or expressed or shared or taught, and that tradition. And so there's stories of Dongshan as a student, there's stories of Dongshan as a teacher working with his students, and often, these stories are particularly slippery or subtle, but the first story goes into why that is so. A lot of the stories have to do with Dongshan's critique of our usual way of seeing the path. So in a lot of traditions, there's this sense of the path as something you do step by step, and eventually you reach, whatever, enlightenment or whatever you want to call it. Dongshan is very, very clear that that's not what he is interested in. Really this idea of the path as stages is stages of practice and systems of stages of practice is not his practice of suchness. So I'll tell one of the stories that illustrates that perspective on the path. A lot of the stories also have to do directly with how to bring awareness or hold awareness of this ultimate suchness in our everyday interactions and activities and perspectives. So there's a number of stories that focus on that. So that's a little bit of introduction. What else should I say generally about Dongshan? Well, just that he's considered the founder of the Caodong or Soto tradition. Again, he lived in the 9th century, but in some ways that tradition extends back before him to teachers like Shuto or Sekito, who wrote the Sandokai, Harmony of Difference and Sameness, and the Song of the Grass Hut, Soanka. And teachers after him, Yaoshan, who was the teacher of Dongshan's teacher, Yunyan. And this whole tradition, again, through the Chinese lineage of Caodong or Soto up to Dogen and beyond, I have this sense of kind of continuity of teaching about this suchness and this practice. So I'm going to just start with what to me is the pivotal story. And as I have stories about Yunyan in the book, but I'm just going to be able to give you a taste today. But this first story is about when Dongshan was leaving his teacher Yunyan, or Ngan Danjo, after some period of training and practice. And before departing, Dongshan asked Yunyan, later if I'm asked to describe your reality or teaching, your Dharma, what should I say? How should I respond? And after some pause, Yunyan said, just this is it. So Dongshan had no response to that. The narration say he was lost in thought. And then Yunyan said to him, you are now in charge of this great matter. You must be most thoroughgoing. We can see that as the opening lines of the Jewel Mara Samadhi. The Dharma of suchness is intimately transmitted from Buddha to ancestor. Now you have it, preserve it well. That's in that original in exchange. The story goes, Dongshan left and was wandering on pilgrimage, and shortly after was wading across a stream, and he looked down and saw his reflection and awakened to the meaning of his exchange with Yunyan. And then Dongshan wrote the following verse, which is, to me, pivotal to our whole tradition. He said, just don't seek from others, or you'll be far estranged from self. I now go on alone. Everywhere I meet it, it now is me. I now am not it. One must understand in this way to merge with suchness. So there's a lot going on here, and I want to talk about it in various ways. In terms of Yunyan's just this is it, we might see this as referring to just the exchange between Yunyan and Dongshan, or maybe just Dongshan asking his teacher what his essential teaching was. But also, more fundamentally, this refers to the simplicity and immediacy of reality, here and now. Just this presence, this awareness. And it's my perspective that when we do Zazen, we all have some taste of this, at least. Just this suchness. Dongshan's, and I'm going to come back to a different way of reading that, because this is a very complicated story, and it's very, very rich. But he says, Dongshan says, just don't seek from others or you'll be far estranged from self. So this is fundamental to a lot of these stories, that this is this sense of presence, of suchness, of this immediacy is is something that one has to experience oneself, and that has a lot to do with a lot of the stories. Then Dongshan says, I now go on alone everywhere I meet it. So we say in the Bodhisattva vows, Dharma gates are boundless, I got to enter them. Every situation is an opportunity to see just this. Then this is, to me, the core line, the core saying of all of Soto Zen. He said, it now is me, I now am not it. And then that one must understand in this way to merge with suchness. So this, so there's a whole lot to say about this line. It now is me, I now am not it. So this has to do with the teaching of non-self, very basic Buddhist teaching. And, you know, any depiction, any story we have about ourself is limited. You know, we can identify ourselves in terms of personal history and stories, in terms of our, I don't know, social security numbers, if you live in the United States, whatever. There are many ways we imagine and understand this I that is not it, according to Dongshan. I now am not it, it now is me. So the one side of this is to see this illusion of a self, this I that we, this egoistic I that we cling to, and then there's the other side of it now is me. But first, this I am not it. One way to understand that, I refer to a number of things from a French symbolist poet named Arthur Rimbaud, who said, Je est un autre, or I is another. And really, this is kind of the fundamental problem here. Our way of thinking in terms of subject-object separates ourselves from others. And so he says, I is another. And as soon as we do that separation, the I just becomes, as Dylan says, nothing more than something we invest in whenever we imagine an I. So this, on the one side is that I am not it. The other side, it now is me, is important, though, because each of us is completely part of everything. The universal, the ultimate suchness, whatever you want to call it, includes each of us. That's not some object. Suchness or emptiness or totality is not some object out there. We each are totally, in our own particular way, an expression of that. So Dogen commented on this line much later in Genjo Koan, which some of you probably know. He said, to carry the self forward and experience myriad things is delusion. That myriad things come forth and experience the self is awakening. So to carry the self forward and experience myriad things, that's I am not it. But that's what we usually do. Our usual way of being and thinking in the world is we have this I, and we see things out there in the world in terms of this I. And that's what Dogen calls delusion. But what he calls awakening is that the myriad things come forth and experience themselves. That is, it now is me. So we are each part of that wholeness, that sense of totality, that the suchness of right now. So this is really subtle and a dynamic kind of way of seeing self and non-self. It's not that, Dogen strongly makes the point, it's not a matter of getting rid of delusion. and getting awakening, as if that was something. And the second story I'm going to talk about is an illustration of that. So there's well, Yunyan is an interesting character in lots of ways. There's some follow-up stories about Dongshan referring to his teacher, and Yunyan was famous as a Zen failure. So the founder of our school was a student of a very famous Zen failure, which might be an encouragement to some of you. Yunyan studied with great teachers like Baizhang and Nanchuan and didn't get it for a long time. But eventually he was able to say to Dongshan, just this is it. Now, there's follow-up stories when Dongshan was a teacher, when he told this story about leaving Yunyan, and Yunyan saying, just this is it. And one of his students came forward and said, when Yunyan said, just this is it, what did he mean? Dongshan responded, at that time, I nearly misunderstood my late teacher. The student then asked, I would say somewhat impudently, did Yunyan himself know it is or not? And Dongshan said this interesting thing. If he did not know what it is, how could he be able to say this? If he did know what it is, how could he be willing to say this? So a lot of the best stories have these unanswerable questions at their heart. What's the dynamic here of how this is conveyed? Dongshan later was asked at a similar occasion when he was honoring Yunyan, how come you honor this guy Yunyan? He was pretty obscure in his own time, but Dongshan had studied under other great teachers such as Nanchuan. Dongshan responded that I do not esteem my late teacher's virtue or his Buddhist teaching. I only value the fact that he did not explain everything for me. So this dynamic of how this teaching in practice of suchness is conveyed is the issue here. Even if Yunyan now is Dongshan and Dongshan meets Yunyan everywhere, Dongshan cannot fully be, and indeed is not Yunyan. Thus, in such a way, Dongshan becomes Dongshan. Dongshan also said about his teacher Yunyan that he only half agreed with him. If I completely agreed, then I would be unfaithful to my teacher. So this is this basic story about suchness. Just this is it. And the dynamic of suchness. I am not in it, now is me. Now, there's a whole other way to read this story, which doesn't. It just amplifies the meaning in some ways, and that is that these pronouns, just this is it, the it in just this, and I am not it now is me in Dongshan's verse, can be read also as personal pronouns. So, in some sense, it doesn't matter what the historical people Yunyan and Dongshan meant, and that's a whole other issue that the history of these people is a little uncertain. So we don't know if this is historically accurate, and that's really kind of besides the point. We have these stories. They've been studied for 1,000 years more. So anyway, the other way of reading the same story is that when, and it's commonly referred to both ways, when Yunyan, after some pause, said, just this is it, that could be read as just this person. This person. So, in the it now is me, I now am not it, or I now go on alone everywhere I meet it, that it's a different pronoun, but it also can be read as a personal pronoun. So it could be everywhere I meet him, or now it might be her. He now is me, I now am not him. Is a different way of reading this that's also legitimate. So right in the middle of this story is a story about the student-teacher relationship, and how one meets one's teacher, and somehow this teaching about suchness itself is inextricably involved with how this teaching is maintained and passed along. So a lot of the stories have to do with that, and we see Dongshan later as a teacher being kind of slippery about how to convey this. There's a lot more to say about this story, actually. Well, I'll just mention that my teacher, Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, some of you may know Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, he paraphrased this story to his Western students. Instead of meeting it, he talks about everywhere meeting oneself. And he has Dongshan saying, don't try to figure out who you are. If you try to figure out who you are, what you understand will be far away from you. You will have just an image of yourself. So this is not a translation, but a paraphrase, but he's talking about wherever I go, I meet myself, he says. So again, a part of the point of these stories is that they're part of our tradition, and we need to bring them alive in each context, in each generation, and now, especially as we're making this huge jump from Japan. Well, Junto's still in Japan, but the rest of us, is anybody else here in Japan? Anyway, in the West and in the modern world, of course, Japan too, how do we use these stories that are kind of the family jewels of Soto tradition? So in the stories, in the book I talk about these stories, but I also give a lot of commentary on them by later Soto teachers like Hongzhi, and also a lot of commentary on these stories by Dogen. Dogen referred to these stories a lot. But I also have modern figures referring to them like Arthur Rimbaud and Krishnamurti and Jack London and Lewis Carroll, and a lot of commentary by Bob Dylan, and some from Grace Slick and Randy Newman, and anyway, and so forth, Bill McKibben. So the point of these stories, and as I said at the beginning that I'm a koan teacher, what I mean by that is that like Dogen, I work with these stories as well as teaching about just sitting, and they're not separate. But these stories are ways of seeing our own practice bodies and ways of seeing how to develop them. And so Dogen's own way of being a koan teacher was very much to, especially in Shobogenzo, to elaborate on them and to expand on them and to associate with other stories, but other contexts from his world. And so that's what I'm trying to do in looking at the Dongshan stories. I'll talk about one more, and I really want, I'm tempted to pause for discussion because there's so much in that story, but we'll just give some discussion time at the end. And there's so many of these stories that are really wonderful. But I'll just tell one more. This is a story that goes again to this idea of the path and where is the path, and Dongshan's very strong perspective on the path as not being a matter of stages of progress. This is really subversive to our usual way of thinking. Often, in our everyday activity, when we are trying to accomplish something, when we have some project, whatever, we see some step-by-step process of how to achieve that, and that's fine. That's our everyday reality, and we need to take care of that. But spiritual practice is something else, and so this is not just unique to Dongshan and Soto Zen. If you look at the Eightfold Path, for example, the Fourth Noble Truth, it's not you do right view, then you do right action, then you do right speech, then you do right livelihood. There's this kind of a circle. And the 5 degrees, which I talk about in the last chapter, or sometimes called 5 ranks, is the same. It's kind of a circle. So we can have a sense of the path, but it's not a path that has to do with stages of progress. So the story, there's several stories about that in the book, but the one I'll tell is when a monk came to meet with Dongshan, and Dongshan asked the monk, "Where have you come from?" And the monk responded, "From wandering in the mountains." Dongshan asked, "Did you reach the peak?" And the monk said, "Yes." Dongshan asked if there was anyone on the peak. And the monk replied, "No, there was not." Dongshan said, "If so, then you did not reach the peak." Well, by definition, if there was no one there, neither was that monk. So, of course, he didn't reach the peak. But this monk was really good. He replied clearly, "If I did not reach the peak, how could I have known there was no one there?" So, I love this story. After that, Dongshan asked why the monk had not remained on the mountaintop. And he replied quite honestly, he would have been inclined to do so, but there was someone from the West, probably he was referring to Bodhidharma or maybe Buddha, who would not have approved. And Dongshan praised him, saying, I doubted this fellow, but didn't thereafter. So, yeah, this story about reaching the peak, and in some ways this echoes our shikantaza practice of just sitting. And I sometimes will give people some object to focus on as a way of settling, and we all need that sometimes to settle and then to open into the spaciousness of just sitting in Zazen. Sometimes I'll talk to them about counting breaths or listening to sound or using mantras in Zazen, but fundamentally we kind of start at the mountaintop. Just sit, just be present. Return to your posture and to your breathing. No object of meditation. So this is part of the serene illumination teaching that Hongzhi talks about too. It's objectless meditation. You're not trying to reach some objective. You're not using some focusing object. It's just sitting, just at the mountaintop. This is challenging practice. Are we okay?
Yes, good.
Okay, I'll keep going then. Let me know if there's some technical problem. So this idea of starting on the mountaintop or being on the mountaintop, where this monk could reach the mountaintop, but then he couldn't stay there. And that's very important too. So in our practice, we don't, bliss out in emptiness or in suchness. We have to come back, and in that context, then we can. We can see the trails that lead up to the mountaintop and investigate them, and even get involved in practicing stages of practice, so-called stages of practice, as a way of just enjoying the terrain from the mountaintop. Again, this just sitting is, in some Buddhist traditions, this is considered extremely, high, lofty practice. The Gelugpa tradition of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, for example, monks are not allowed to do this kind of meditation until they've been studying texts for years and years. In our practice, we study Dogen or the sutras, or in the Sutta tradition, the teaching stories, these teaching stories, as a way of encouraging ourselves just to be present here with this. So there's another story about this that's related, and this is from one of Dongshan's principal disciples. He had quite a few, actually, but Yunju Daoying, Ungo Doyo, is the one from whom Dogen's lineage and our lineage comes from. And so there are a lot of stories between Yunju and Dongshan. And one time, Yunju came back to the monastery, and Dongshan asked him where he'd been, and Yunju replied that he'd been walking in the mountains. Dongshan asked if he had found a mountain to reside on. So in Zen, that refers to finding a place to settle and teach. And Yunju said very emphatically that there were no mountains suitable for residing. Dongshan asked if Yunju had visited all of the mountains in the country. Yunju said he had not. Dongshan commented that Yunju must have found an entry path. And here, very interesting, Yunju says, no, there's no path. And there's numbers of places where that kind of statement are repeated in the Dongshan stories. Dongshan said, if there is no path, I wonder how you ever came to lay eyes on this old monk. And Yunju replied, if there were a path, then a mountain would stand between us. Dongshan approved, saying that henceforth not even 10,000 people could hold down Yeonju. So the very idea of a path implies separation. If there's some distance in space or time that needs to be traversed to get to a particular destination, that's the idea of the path. And Yeonju disdains any path and affirms that his present communion with Dongshan. So whenever we're trying to get somewhere else, whenever we're not willing to be where we are, to be in this suchness, then we have this sense of separation. And of course we do, as human beings, have a sense of separation. It's maybe, I'd say it's part of what brought me to practice, and maybe for some of you too, the sense of estrangement from the world and each other and other beings and from reality itself. But our practice is not to get to somewhere else. It's to see that this suchness is already right here. So again, Dongshan is very emphatic about there not being some path to get to somewhere else. He talks about the bird's path as one of his images, and the bird's path being very ephemeral. And we don't, maybe birds can see their path of migration. We can't. So the path is something that's maybe we need it. So Gary Snyder talks about the path as a structure or guideline, but then the reality of our practice is sauntering off the path, as Gary puts it. Dylan says, "Are birds free from the chains of the skyway?" How do we actually be present in this life, in our reality, right here, each in our particular way, to express that which is the practice of being on the mountaintop in our particular situation, in our particular culture, in our particular life, with our particular sanghas and friends and family and so forth. So each of us has our own way of doing that. There's not one right way to respond to the situation. The practice of skillful means is to try things and use what we each have at hand and play with that. And these stories are the same. How do we play with these old teaching stories, these suttas and family jewels, to put it that way, and see how they apply in our own context, in our own world. So I'm tempted to refer to some of the other stories because there's so many and they're so wonderful. Well, I'll just say a little bit more about suchness. So it's important to say that suchness is not a thing, just like emptiness is not a thing. Suchness is the way things is. But again, referring to Yeonju Daoying on Godoyo, he said, if you want such a thing, you must be such a person. Already being such a person, why trouble about such a thing? Or you could read the first one line as, if you want suchness, you must be a person of suchness. So this sense of the immediacy of suchness, I'll just read a comment on that by Dogen. Life is borne along by the passage of time, hardly to be kept for even a moment. Rosy cheeks have gone away somewhere, so they vanish. As they vanish, there are no traces. When we look carefully, there are many things gone which we can never see again. The red heart doesn't stay either. It comes and goes bit by bit. So the tenderness and reality of our life is coming and going, but there's also this underlying suchness that is always here. And to be a person of suchness, just meet that suchness. So again, this idea of the path, it doesn't apply just to spiritual practice, but in so many ways, we're in our everyday life, we're always trying to get somewhere else, not appreciating or being grateful for that which we have, and maybe particularly in modern Western consumerist society, where we're encouraged to get more of this and that, and to get rid of the things we don't want. That kind of consumerist culture is pushing us away from suchness. Um, I think I will stop now. I can keep babbling for the next 3 hours, but easily, but I won't. I would love to hear your comments, questions about anything related to any of this, and have some discussion. So, Junto, take it away.
Thank you so much, Taigen. It was lovely. And yes, we're going to open for questions now. The people here, please raise your hand if you have a question. And folks at home, I'm checking email. Please send your questions jundotreeleaf@gmail.com. Who has a question? And my students all have questions, I know. Yes, we'll start with Daizan.
Thank you. Why do we begin estranged?
Excuse me?
Why do we begin estranged?
Why do we begin estranged?
Why do we feel estranged?
Yeah. Why do we feel estranged?
Our usual way of thinking, embedded in our language, in all languages, subject, object, subject, predicate, object. We see things out there as objects. We see the world as a bunch of dead objects. Actually the story that brought Dongshan to Yunyan in the first place is about his, so it's a long, complicated story, but about Dongshan's inquiry into whether or how so-called non-sentient beings expound the Dharma or express the Dharma. And this was a whole discourse about Buddha nature that was part of Chinese Buddhism, not just in Zen, but of course Dogen takes that up in Shobogen's Buddha nature. But we see the world out there as something separate, and it's built into our language. It's built into our ways of thinking. So, of course, to babies, there's a reference to this in the Jewel Mare Samadhi, babies see things as kind of whole, and then eventually they recognize their mother and as a source of nourishment. And so it's necessary, just maybe to survive adolescence, to develop an ego, to develop a sense of our separate identity. But it's not real. Or it's one side of reality. It's a conventional reality. But there's other ultimate reality. In this ultimate reality, there is no separation. There's the distinction between each one of you. So that's the I am not it now is me. Each one of us is not it, but it includes each one of us, each in our own way. It's a very subtle dynamic. But this sense of separation, it's not even just in materialist cultures. It's just part of the nature of human consciousness to make these distinctions. And our practice is about seeing the side of reality and the side of our life that goes through that, goes beyond that. So that's my response.
Thank you.
I have a question from Shoka Catherine at home. She writes, most of Western culture is ingrained with the idea that if you work hard, you will achieve.
Yes.
And that often involves a set path. But with the idea that Buddhism doesn't have a set path or stages, do you think that makes Buddhism less accessible to some Westerners? And how do you overcome that?
Well, we start off by offering a path. So, of course, you follow your breath or count your breaths, or there are things you can do to help settle into this deeper space. And there are ways in which we can practice in the context of a path. But whether it's less accessible in the West, I don't know. I think there's more of a need now in our Western context for Sangha, for awakening, for seeing something deeper. And our usual materialist, consumerist world has led us to huge inequalities in resources and to climate damage, which threatens to devastate our whole habitat. So, we need to see some other way of being, as well as this sense of accomplishing things. Now, there's the Buddhist practice of vow or commitment, and sometimes there are things we want to accomplish, and then we do need to see step by step. So it's not that you should get rid of all of that, but to see it in the context of this present immediacy and suchness is the point.
Please raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, Kyonin from Mexico.
Hi.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about success.
Success?
Right, because you mentioned this story about the student that climbs to a mountain top, and I could see in my mind that this is kind of an analogy for what success is in our culture. And we try to achieve success very actively, that we get lost in the process. And I think we lose a lot more than we can achieve if we just focus on achieving things or being successful. So my question is, can we apply this analogy to that koan you just read to us?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question exactly. Partly it depends on what do you mean by success. If you're trying to reach some higher status or accomplish some particular task, well, it's a
right. That's what I was thinking about.
Sorry?
That's what he meant.
Yeah. Well, but I think redefining success is important, practically, for us in practice. How do we succeed in being helpful to the people around us, to the world, to ourselves? So, that's okay to strive for success in that way, but part of the point of this practice, it now is me, I now am not it, is this background of this realization or just this taste or glimpse of something deeper, something that goes beyond. So part of our practice is having this sense of the ultimate or the universal, and this background of perfect balance against our constantly going in and out of balance. Having a sense of wholeness as a background allows us to take care of the practical realities, which we do need to take care of. So there's the ultimate reality, and there's the conventional reality, and in the latter, we do need to take care of things in order to be helpful. So that's coming down from the mountaintop, which we need to do. We can't stay up there. That's built into our practice, and the most dangerous attachment, according to great teachers going back to Nagarjuna, the most dangerous attachment is the attachment to non-attachment. So I'm not talking about that. But this background balance, this background taste of suchness includes a sense of, or a resource of creative energy that we can bring forth into the problems of our world and the problems of our own life and apply there too. But if by success you mean reaching some fancy state, the practice is not about getting high. It's not about reaching some higher state of being or higher mental state. It's about how do we practice in our reality, but with this background sense of this immediacy and suchness, which we all have tasted in Zazen.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I have a question from Trudy, who's watching at home. It's, after translating so much of Dogen's work, do you feel you got a sense of who Dogen was as a person? Would you go so far as saying that you would have liked him or not if you had been his contemporary? Let me just add a personal note. Over years of reading Dogen, I find him like an old football coach. He was a real son of a gun sometimes, and I'm not sure he was always a nice guy. What do you think, Taigen?
Oh, well, I don't know. What's a nice guy? Anyway, um, if you want to get a sense of Dogen as a person, look at Eihei Koroku, Dogen's extensive record. The Shobogenzo essays are beautiful and lovely, and that's where he's expanding on these teaching stories and free associating from them and bringing in other stories and references from his East Asian world. In the kind of ironically, the Eihei Koroku, or Dogen's extensive record, is more formal. These short little talks he gave. But he's talking to his students up at, and most of it is talking to his students up at Eiheiji and actually training his successors who made Soto Zen, one of the two predominant forms of Japanese Buddhism in the centuries thereafter. And you get a sense of him, his warmth, his humor. Dogen's very funny. I mean, he's very ironic. You kind of have to be there. You have to imagine being there to get the humor. It's kind of dry sometimes, but so there's a sense of humor. There's sometimes this tremendous sense of warmth and caring for his students. So that comes across more, I think, in Eihei Koroku, Dogen's extensive record. So yeah, I don't know. Would I have liked to meet him? I don't know. I would have liked to have been his student, but in some ways I am.
Very good. Another question? Okay, Joyo. What? Oh, there you are.
I'm sorry for the chainsaw outside my door sound.
That was you. It's all right.
I just wanted to ask you. I think you said the most dangerous attachment is attachment to non-attachment. Is that right?
Excuse me? Say it again.
Did you say the most dangerous attachment is attachment to non-attachment?
Yeah, I said that, but so did Nagarjuna and Dogen and many other teachers.
Okay. Could you explain that more? What that means exactly?
So good, thank you. Very important question. So yeah, when we get a sense of non-attachment, of letting go of things that we're kind of holding on to, it can be very opening and liberating and wonderful and spacious, and we might feel like we're on the mountaintop or somewhere on the mountainside anyway. But it's like that monk who was inclined to stay on the mountaintop. This doesn't usually happen in lay practice, in daily practice, but if you go to some practice place, I lived in monasteries for several years, one can become a Buddha by decoration, it's called. You can just enjoy the spaciousness of suchness and forget about the basic purpose of this, which is helping suffering beings. So, Suzuki Roshi, my teacher's teacher, once said that the problem that you have right now, you will always have. I'm not sure I totally agree, because sometimes we get rid of our problems. Sometimes we let go of habits. But if you completely get rid of all your problems, somebody else will come and give you theirs. So I think we need to study our attachments. Dogen said to study the ways to study the self. We need to know what our attachments are, and some of them you might want to stay attached to, But if you try and get rid of all of them and be like this pure, ethereal, vacant being, then you're not of much help to anybody else in the world. And the world needs help now. So our practice is about finding this space of suchness so that we can use that to help rather than harm, and help all of the difficulties in our lives and in the world. So being attached to non-attachment is dangerous. Having a sense of non-attachment is really wonderful and helpful. But then, so we're electromagnetic beings. We have attractions and aversions. So some of you, I can't see you all. I don't know how many of you prefer vanilla and how many of you prefer chocolate. So think about that for a second. Maybe some of you don't like either. Maybe some of you like both. But to acknowledge our and be familiar with and intimate with our preferences and our attachments. If we know what we're up to, if we know our own patterns of grasping and anger and confusion, and are willing to face that and see that, and through periods of Zazen, see that stuff being a technical term, see all that coming up, then when it comes up in our life, we're less likely to act harmfully based on it. We have a better chance of responding in a helpful way. So yeah, you have to, being non-attachment means acknowledging and accepting your attachments and not getting attached to non-attachment or not having any attachments. That's not real or human, in my opinion. I hope that helps.
Good. Sergey, Walter, anyone? Any question? I'll ask a quick one. Taigen, you've seen a few decades of Soto Zen coming to the West and Zen in general. How do you think we're doing? That's Sanskrit, yes, Oi? That's...
Yeah, pre-Sanskrit. I don't know. I think lots of people are trying different things. I appreciate, Jindo, that you're doing this online Sangha, and it's not something I could do. But it's, we have to experiment. We have to see what works. We'll probably know, what Soto Zen and what's appropriate for Soto Zen in the West in maybe in 200 or 300 years. Maybe. It took 500 years after Buddhism was introduced to China for it to become really Chinese. So I think it's okay that there's experimentation and that we don't know what Zen is. And, there are branches and lineages of Western Zen that are about trying to reach some particular, state of being or something, and I don't know. That seems like not so helpful to me. But I trust Zazen. If people just keep doing Zazen and studying the good teachers and the sutras and all these old stories, I think we'll find our way.
Okay, I have a question from Lee at home who says he has given up trying to understand Dogen after reading many, many books explaining Dogen. Do you think that Dogen always knew what Dogen meant, or did he just feel what he meant? I'm not sure of the question, but I think it's you get it.
I hear the question, and it's a really good question. Thank you for saying it. I meant to say this. So congratulations, Lee. Yeah, these stories are not about getting some understanding. So please don't try and understand Dogen. But please enjoy Dogen. Please allow yourself to play with these stories, to to see where they fit for you in your practice, and that's the point. The stories are not something to figure out or understand, or figure out some answer to or some response to. Just get into the story. So the way I teach with these stories is I teach in my talks, but also with individual students. I have my own koan curriculum, and it's not about getting to any particular place with it, but to work with a story for a while until it becomes part of your practice body. But we never finish with any of these stories. I mean, that's kind of ridiculous, to graduate so that you don't need to look at that story anymore. These stories have been studied for 1,000 years, and more. So how do you engage with the stories, or with Dogen, reading Shobogenzo essays or reading Eikoroku? some of it, there are parts of it that I don't understand at all, and that's okay. Some of it I have some understanding of. It's possible, but the point isn't whether or not you understand. The point is, how do you see what he's saying and use that in your own practice, and see what you would say to that, and then check it with someone. So it's possible to have unhelpful misunderstandings. It may be possible to have helpful misunderstandings, but the point isn't to stand under them. The point is to let them become part of your practice body. So I've taught Dogen academically too, and but even there, I say don't try and figure out what he means necessarily. See what resonates with you and your practice and your sense of being, and see how to use that. So there's a lot more to say about that, but maybe that's a good start. So again, Lee, congratulations on not understanding Dogen.
Bryson, Sergey? Walter, you always have a lot of questions for me. Eh? Ah, Bryson, good. Yeah, there you go. Bryson, Indonesia.
Cool.
Hi, Taigen.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your talk and for taking these questions from us. I was recently at the zendo of the teacher of a friend of mine, and after sitting in the evening, we sat and had dinner, and sitting around the table, one of the chaps that was there with us fancied himself as a bit of an engaged Buddhist. So he asked the question of the teacher, what sort of things he could do to better the lot of fellow sentient beings, etc. And the teacher pretty well shut down the conversation for the rest of the night by bringing up suchness as a thing, and saying that these folks should just be content where they are in that space, and perhaps not aspire to other things. And I just wondered if you had any comment on that interpretation.
Can I just drop in here? If this is the same story you said, also the subject of how to clean up Fukushima came up, and the fellow just said, "Is Fukushima's in your mind?" or something like that.
Well, it was a different story, same place. Yeah.
Okay, Fukushima is not just in your mind. Fukushima, Jindo, you live in Tokyo?
I live 100 miles from Fukushima.
Well, the governor of, or maybe it was one of the prime ministers, said that Tokyo should actually be vacated because it's so dangerous. So I hope you're okay, Jundo.
Don't believe what you read in the papers.
Well, okay, I know. I know. The problems of nuclear power is something I've studied for many, many, many years, for decades. Fukushima is still dangerous, it's still releasing radiation. In going back to the basic question, suchness is to see the suchness of what's going on in the world. It doesn't mean to be unresponsive at all. So I disagree with that teacher from what you said about what he said. Suchness does not mean to just. It's not passive. This is an important point that I didn't get to, but it's very important. Suchness doesn't mean being passive. Suchness doesn't mean accepting things just as they are, no matter what. Suchness is seeing the reality of things, and then the point of our practice is how to respond. So the Lotus Sutra says, probably the most important Buddhist scripture in East Asia, that Buddhas appear in the world for the sake of helping suffering beings onto the path of awakening. How do we help suffering beings? And so I'm myself a social activist and very concerned about racism in America, about climate. I've been talking about climate damage for a long time. Just because we have a sense of suchness, just because we've tasted suchness and realized the wonder and joy of reality and how that affects our life, we have to come down from the mountaintop. It sounds like that teacher, from what you said, was stuck on the mountaintop. we can respond to the situations of the world. So I've been responding to climate damage by talking about it, fairly regularly in Dharma talks, and talking about the reality of it. Now, how to respond is the question, and our idea of problem solving and fixing things is often not helpful. So we can respond more helpfully from a place that's settled, from a place where we have this communion with suchness, with just this as it is, and often we don't know how to respond. And if so, we have to acknowledge that to ourselves. So the point isn't to have one right response. In fact, each one of us has our own particular way of responding to the situations of the world. It's not that there's one right tactic or strategy or way of responding. The Bodhisattva of compassion, Kanzeon, has 1,000 arms, each with an eye and with different tools, and the practice of skillful means is trial and error. So first, and this is related to the practice of patience, Kshanti Paramita, the paramita of tolerance, forbearance, or patience, which is also not passive at all. It's a very dynamic and active practice to just pay attention and watch and become informed, and and to listen to other perspectives too. It's not about being right, because right view is a matter of being open to many views and not trying to project your view onto the world, as in to carry yourself forward to experience myriad things as delusion. We have to look and see how to respond helpfully and listen to others. And so most of what I do is just talking about these issues. I'm going to be speaking August 6th, which some of you may know in Japan, is the date of actually this coming August 6th is the 70th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, and I'm going to be speaking along with some others at a site down at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park in Chicago, the site of the first controlled nuclear reaction by Enrico Fermi, which was on the campus of the University of Chicago. There's a Henry Moore statue there now, and I'll be one of the people speaking about that. I think it's that one of the keys to practice, one of the things I've been talking about a lot recently is to practice with and engage with sadness and grief. And so the denial of climate change, for example, has to do with not just the fossil fuel billionaires who are putting lots of money into fake science, but also with our own unwillingness to face the difficulties and the sadness and the grief in our own lives. And since Hiroshima, we've had this possibility of there not being a future. So maybe Soto Zen in the West won't exist in a couple hundred years because all the human beings will be in the backs of caves or something. I don't think so. I think I'm not pessimistic. I think it's important not to be hopeless, not to feel overwhelmed. Everything we do can make a difference. So this is the side of coming down from the mountain. But if we have this sense of suchness, of just this, of this immediacy, that really gives a much wider option, much wider space in which to listen and try things and respond helpfully. And there are lots of ways of responding helpfully. There's not one right way. So I could keep talking about this, but maybe that's enough to start. But if you have follow-ups, Jundo or anyone else, please.
Well, as we come into the home stretch here, let me just say there was one good follow-up from Shoka about her question on consumerism I'd like to ask you. She says, do you feel that Zen and meditation in general are beginning to be used as another cog in the consumerism culture? What I mean by this is that in the West in recent times, we have seen the very rapid rise of meditation centers, exotic retreats, expensive cushions, etc., etc.
Yeah, well, that happens. You know, I mean, this is that's the economy that we live in, and so okay, but the basic practice cuts through that. You don't need a fancy regulation black zafu to sit on. You know, you can use pillows or whatever. The point is, how do we find our seat in the middle of all of it? So, of course, yeah, everything that's authentic gets used, can be used in ways as a kind of consumerist object. But that shouldn't stop us from continuing our own practice.
Okay, well, we're going to get to the end. I just want to say, just because you're our first visitor from the Ukraine, hi, Sergey, give us a wave in the Ukraine. Good, 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 good. And Walter, you're almost as far there. Walter, everything good? Good, good, good.
Where's Walter?
Walter's in Argentina.
Cool.
So, all right, this is your last chance. Anyone have a question?
Sorry, I'm currently in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and working here for the time being.
No, they're visiting.
Yes.
All right, this is it. Last chance. Okay,
Questions?
that's a strong wave, Sekishi. Can't say no. Go ahead.
Thank you. I had a question about as a teacher and an author. I had a question about using language as a skillful means to really connect with students. Specifically, I really like your use of suchness. I'm assuming as opposed to emptiness, void, shunyata, Tao, right? Like we have all these words that people try to use to point to this truth.
Right.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you choose that word, if you've shifted over time, and maybe not that one in particular, but a little bit about the use of language as a difficult tool to talk about these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Well, suchness is thusness is another equally valid translation of the term that Dongshan's actually using. As such, translation is a difficult art. So I was sort of equating suchness. I don't think suchness and emptiness are exactly the same things. They're different ways of seeing the same thing, maybe. But I was equating suchness with the ultimate or the universal, or there's lots of ways of talking about it, none of which are accurate. So the words all miss it, but that's part of these stories, these Zen teaching stories or koans, is that even in good translations, and it's not even in the original Chinese, the words themselves are not it. So that in the Precious Mare Samadhi, there's I'm going to get it from my book. There's some lines that directly relate to this. It's an important question because I think we do need, as you indicated, we need to use language, but we shouldn't be fooled by language. So this is the basic teaching, and it comes from Dongshan himself. Well, supposedly, the Jewel Mare Samadhi is attributed to him, but there's a couple lines that are quite relevant. The meaning does not reside in the words, but a pivotal moment brings it forth. So the meaning is not in the words, but when we bring our energy to the situation, something comes forth, something arises. We can convey something using the words, but reading these stories, reading Dogen, it's like learning a foreign language. We have to see what's the context, what is being pointed at, as you accurately said. He's in the Jewel Mare Samadhi again. It says, just to portray it in literary form is to stain it with defilement. So, this was a challenge for Dogen too, who was a great poet in some ways, and to not get caught. The point of these stories isn't some verbal or word game. And so actually the Jewel Mare Samadhi talks a lot about how to use language. But also acknowledges that that it can be talked about. I'm trying to find that line. There's a line about that. Anyway, the point is that anything we say isn't exactly it, and as Katagiri Roshi said, we have to say something. So but there are lots of ways of saying something. A lot of them are nonverbal. Just by taking good care, just by your posture, by taking good care of the things around you, by using the ritual forms of Zen and in Gasho and bowing in many ways, and in acting kindly, that conveys the teaching maybe better than the words. And yet, we can use language to point to something, as you said. And that's part of our tradition. And it's not enough for you to read what Dogen says or what some teaching story says. You have to kind of translate that for your context and your practice.
All right. If anyone's got a pressing life or death question, jump up and down. Otherwise, I'm going to thank Taigen for his time. I'm just going to get my hands in here, offer you a quick show from the side. And thank you very, very much. I'm glad we overcame a couple of technical issues, and it all worked together. It was a good, lovely experience, I think, for everyone, and including the people who just joined the conversation with silence. They may be the wisest of us all.
Well, yes, silence is an important way of talking.
Let me leave you. Any final words before we go, Taigen?
Well, there's a lot more stories in the book, so I really, encourage you to read some of these stories and to use them as a way of illuminating your own practice and engaging in the world. Dongshan stories are really subtle. I'm trying to think of one short one that I can. Well, okay. There's this one of my favorite stories of his is a student came to Dongshan and asked him which of the bodies of Buddha does not fall into any categories. So referring to the three bodies, the Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya, these ways of talking about what Buddha is, which is really the fundamental question. So which of the three bodies does not fall into any category? And Dongshan responded, I am always close to this. And it's a wonderful story, and I have a whole chapter on it, and it really has to do with close or intimate. How do we remain intimate with our own reality and our own questioning? And I can say a lot more, but maybe I'll leave it at that.
All right, we'll leave it there. Let's offer Gasho to Taigen, and thank you so much. All right, I'll wish a good evening to everybody. Thank you again, Taigen. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.